always love hip-hop. Keep it flowing like a river, so I drip drop. Verses and bars, we eating dinner with the stars. Excuse me while I float away, my brain is on Mars. Cause it's the Big Kids Podcast with Chris Williams. Sit back, relax, like your spliff, we in the building.
Yo, this is Chris Williams, and welcome back to a different type of episode of the Big Kids Podcast. This week on the Big Kids Podcast, I'm going to take you through the top 15 UFC fighters of all time. Now, while putting this list together, you come across a lot of great fighters from different organizations, different backgrounds, different fighting styles, and it can become difficult to try to formulate a top 15, 10, or even 5. So with that being said, I had to narrow down a lot of the criteria that I was looking for when compiling this list. Now, I want to read you guys a little disclaimer before we go any further, just so in the comments or in my DMs, I'm not getting a whole bunch of hate for how I came together with this list. Again, this is my list, and I would love to have a discussion with you guys about your list. But this list was restricted to strictly what these fighters have accomplished in the UFC. Even though Pride, the WEC, and Strikeforce was bought by Zuffa, which is who the UFC used to be owned by, those fights and accomplishments will not be counted towards this list. Alright, so we're taking into consideration popularity, wins, title wins, who they beat, in what manner they beat them in, and what is most important, timing. Timing is absolutely everything. Who you beat, when you beat them, what that meant for the history of the UFC. So with that said, guys, let's start at number 15. Number 15, Hoist Gracie. Now, if you're going to do a top 15 list about UFC fighters, especially a top 15 list, you cannot forget about the UFC godfather, Hoist Gracie. Now, Hoist's family is the one that came up with the idea of the UFC, or the UFC tournament at the time, because they wanted to be able to prove that fighting wasn't all about strength, that it was also about technique. And it's not even like Hoist was the best Gracie at the time. He had older brothers that were more credentialed and on the surface better picks for the tournament. But the Gracies wanted to be able to sell jiu-jitsu, which apparently it worked. We all know what jiu-jitsu is today. But they wanted to be able to sell that the everyday man could take down a giant. He could take down the best boxer in the room. He could take down the best wrestler in the room. He could take out the best judo guy in the room, if they were able to learn this style of martial arts. And now, while the competition wasn't the cream of the crop at the time, Royce was able to win 3 out of the first 4 tournaments and was well on his way to winning UFC 3 before having to pull out due to exhaustion after a legendary battle with Chemo. Chemo was a 6'3", 250-pound Hawaiian that carried a massive cross on his back for his entrance walk to his first UFC fight. He also, during this time, went on to beat Ken Shamrock and Dan Severn, who were both UFC Superfight champions, which would later be equivalent to being the heavyweight championship. So, like I said earlier, you can't really do a top 15 list without giving credit where credit is due. And we have no idea where the UFC would be, if we would be watching it, anything along those lines, if it wasn't for Hoist. Number 14, Max Holloway. Max Holloway possesses a UFC record of 19-7. Now, while he is tied for the second most losses on this list, he's also in second place with wins with 19. Now, let me be clear, that's not second most wins in UFC history. That is second most wins out of anybody on this list, with 2 people being tied for first place ahead of him. Now, during his 28-fight UFC tenure, Max Holloway possesses wins over Charles Oliveira, Anthony Pettis, 2 over Jose Aldo, Brian Ortega, and Frankie Edgar. He has 5 UFC title wins. He's 5-4 in championship fights, losing the last 3 to Alexander the Great Volkanovski, who I very much debated putting in the 14th spot, but I gave it to Max Holloway due to longevity. Now, Max Holloway possesses damn near every single striking record in the UFC featherweight division, from total strikes thrown to total strikes landed to total strikes absorbed. He owns them all. So that is what gave him the edge over Alex. And with having 28 UFC professional fights, with 19 wins and 5 of them being for UFC titles, there was no other choice but to put Max Blessed Holloway at number 14. Number 13, Cain Velasquez. Now, Cain had a 15-fight UFC career. Not the longest by any stretch of the imagination, but it was very effective. Cain was 12-3 during his UFC career, with key wins over Chet Congo, Big Nog, Brock Lesnar, and Junior Dos Santos 2 times. Now, during his tenure, he had 4 championship wins in one of the best trilogies in UFC history with Junior Dos Santos, losing the first fight and then winning the next 2 in dominant fashion. Even with Francis Ngannou being the current UFC champion and having a win over an aging Cain, Cain is still the prototype that you want in your UFC heavyweight champion. Endless cardio, could push the pace, and never ever really backed down. Now, during his tenure in the UFC and over the course of his 12 wins, 4 of them were for championships. He also has the most takedowns in UFC history at 34, most title strikes in UFC heavyweight history at 1,464, and he's 4-2 in championship fights, losing to Junior Dos Santos, which was previously already stated, and also by misjudging the climate in which he was going to be fighting Fabricio Verdum. They fought in Mexico. The elevation in Mexico is a lot higher than where Cain typically trains at, AKA in California. So when Cain got out to Mexico City, after the first round, he was completely gassed, and this goes against everything that we've known about Cain up until this point. His nickname is Cardio Cain. So this is when the beginning of the end for Cain started to happen. He would go on to beat Travis Brown, but then he would tear up his knee and get sent into another realm while fighting Francis Ngannou. But the reason for putting Cain at number 13 was for his pure dominance while he was a fighter. He lost 2 fights at the end of his career, one of which pretty much put his career to an end. He is still the standard for the biggest and most recognizable weight division in the UFC, and that's why he has to be on this list at number 13. It completely goes against the made-up rules of a top 10, top 15, top 20 list to not have heavyweights on there. Number 12, Jose Aldo, the King of Rio. Now, Jose has a very interesting case. He fought for the WEC, which at the time was owned by the UFC, but the UFC did not have a 145-pound division. So when the WEC and the UFC merged, they also brought Jose Aldo and promoted him as the UFC featherweight champion. So Jose started off his career started his UFC career, I should say, fighting for UFC belts. Now, while this may sound like a gimme to some, Jose Aldo very much deserved this, and he proved it over the course of the next couple years, gaining key wins over Kenny Florian, Chad Mendez twice, Frankie Edgar twice, who was the former lightweight champion, and he also beat Korean Zombie. It was a freak accident during the fight, but Jose was completely in control before that accident happened. Now, with all of that said, he is the first UFC featherweight champion. You know, I think you have to always take that into consideration. Being the first at something and then going out there and setting the standard for most title defenses at 7 or title wins at 7, that has to be taken into consideration when formulating a list like this. The man was 8-3 in championship fights and is still to this day top 5 at bantamweight. The man dropped down a weight class. It started off a little rough, but he has recently racked off 3 in a row, and he is probably 1 fight away from fighting for the UFC 135-pound championship. Now, if those types of standards do not land you on the list, I don't know what does. Jose Aldo at number 12. Number 11, Matt Hughes. Matt Hughes was 18-7 during his 2 runs in the UFC. He had key wins over Carlos Newton twice, Sean Shirk, Frank Trigg, George St Pierre, considered one of the greatest of all time, and you know you'll see him later on this list. He has a win over a young George St Pierre, Hoist Gracie, BJ Penn, and Matt Serra, everyone's favorite. Now, when it comes to Matt Hughes, many tend to forget the dominance that he had over his 2 runs with the UFC, the second one being a lot more dominant than the first one. But during his time with the UFC, he has set the standard for most finishes in welterweight history. At 11, the man had 11 finishes and 18 wins. He was also 9-2 in championship fights. 1 loss being to BJ Penn, the other one being to George St Pierre. Now, he did have another championship fight with Joe Riggs scheduled, but Joe Riggs came in at 2.5 pounds overweight, so that got changed to a non-title fight. So if you want to be technical, he's 9-2 in championship fights, but he could kind of be, if you're being technical in another direction, 10-2 in championship fights. Now, Matt has come onto some hard times in recent history. His truck got stuck on a railroad track and he got hit by a train, and he has been on a path to recovery, and you should see this guy. Is honestly very inspiring, and that's coming from someone as cynical as me. Matt and I may have different political views, but you cannot discount the 18 UFC wins, the 9 or 10 championship wins, in the people that he got some of these wins over. You cannot discount that. And what he has been able to do post train accident just shows how much work and dedication you know he was putting in back in the day when he was competing in the UFC. This whole list so far is about setting standards. It's about making history. And you cannot talk about the UFC without giving this man his flowers, without showing him the respect that he deserves for what he was able to do in the UFC and how he's been able to inspire people since dealing with such a humongous tragedy that most people would not be able to come back from. He set the standard for mental toughness, and that's why he's number 11 on this list. Now we're entering the top 10. And at number 10, we have Kamaru Usman. Kamaru Usman is 15-0 in the UFC and has an upcoming fight with Leon Edwards August 20th, 2022. Just throwing that out there in case the results don't go exactly Kamaru's way. But at present, he is 15-0 in the UFC. He already owns a win over Leon Edwards. He's beaten title challenger, multiple time title challenger, Damian Maia. He's beaten lightweight champion Rafael Dos Anjos, former welterweight champion Tyron Woodley, former interim title champion Colby Covington, BMF champion Jorge Masvidal. He's beaten those last 2 guys 2 times apiece. He is the Tough 21 winner, and he is 6-0 in championship fights. Now, while his book is still being written, you have to take the time to appreciate what he has done. And I remember saying this to an MMA friend when he first won the championship. They were upset. Oh, he's boring. I don't really like watching him fight. But I said the more he wins, the more title defenses that go under his belt, the more you'll come to appreciate him. The more you'll come to appreciate the dominance. And you'll look forward to watching his fights. Even if they are deemed boring, which they're not. He's always worked for a finish. It just sometimes did not work for him until recently. But now he's got the finish button going. He's got the combo going. He's not just out here button mashing, trying to get the finish. He knows the right coordinates. He's been getting his finishes, and since then he's been getting a lot of respect. He currently sits as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the whole entire world, and that is no basic feat. That is hard work. That is determination. That is dominance. That's how you get to be #1 pound-for-pound in the world. And at 6-0 in championship fights, and 15-0 in the UFC, it's been almost a decade since this man has lost. At this point, and with another probable win coming in a couple weeks, you have no choice but to show this man respect and put him in the top 10 of the UFC all-time fighters. At number 9, we have probably my second favorite fighter on this whole entire list, and that's Amanda Nunes. Now, while I personally believe that women's MMA is probably at the evolutionary standpoint that men's MMA was in the early to mid 2000s, you still cannot take away from the Mike Tyson effect that this woman has had on virtually every single person that she has fought. She stands at 14-2 in the UFC and has an upcoming rematch from her last fight, which was a loss against Juliana Pena. Now, that fight, Amanda seemed to be a little more wrestling heavy than she typically is, and that seemed to tire her out. That allowed Juliana to work her jab, get Amanda even more tired out than she already was, and was eventually able to sink in a rear naked choke. So that fight will be very important for the continuation of Amanda's career, but I do not believe that affects where she stands on this list. Now, Kamaru could slide a couple spots if he does lose in a couple weeks, but I do not believe that this fight makes or breaks what Amanda has done up until this point. She has key wins over the Iron Lady, Jermaine Durandamine. She has 2 wins over Valentina Shevchenko. She's beaten Miocic Tate, Ronda Rousey, Chris Cyborg, and Holly Holm. She was a double champ, bantamweight and featherweight, and was the first UFC fighter to defend 2 different belts while still holding both belts. Now, that'll come into play later on down the list, but she was the first person to walk in the ring with 2 belts and leave the ring with 2 belts. There was other people who would at one time be the light heavyweight champion and then the heavyweight champion, and then get rid of one belt, defend the other belt, something along those lines. But while she defended the featherweight championship, she was still the bantamweight champion. She defended that belt already, and by defending the featherweight belt, she became the first person to do so. I know it's a little convoluted, but she was the first one to do that. She has the most title wins in UFC women's history, and she's done most of them in devastating fashion. She is 9-1 in UFC championship fights, with her last one being a loss. If she is able to avenge her loss next week, she may move up on this list. I had a very hard debate with her. Number 9 through 7 was a very hard debate for me and where I place those people. And if she's able to regain that belt and avenge that loss, she very easily could slide from number 9 to number 7 on this list. And with that said, guys, she had to be top 10, and that's why I put her at number 9. Number 8, Daniel Cormier. Daniel Cormier does it for the round bodies. Being a fellow round body, I have not always been a fan of Daniel Cormier, but once I came to respect what he was doing and how he was doing it, there is nothing but love between the two of us. But during his tenure with the UFC, Daniel Cormier is 11-3 with 1 no contest. The 1 loss and 1 no contest comes from Jon Jones. We'll get into Jon later on in this list. But the other 2 losses come from a man who is also on this list in Stipe Miocic. Now, during his time with the UFC, DC was able to defeat former heavyweight champion Frank Mir, former UFC heavyweight tournament champion Dan Henderson, Rumble Johnson twice, Alexander Gustafsson twice, Anderson Silva, Stipe Miocic, and Derek Lewis. So while he also lost to Stipe, he was also able to beat Stipe, and the 3rd fight was very much confrontational, with eye pokes going on. Some of the scorecards from the judges were questionable, but even with that said, he was a double champion. He was the first fighter to defend both titles. And again, it goes back to Amanda Nunes' entry on this. It gets a little convoluted, but he was the first person to defend at light heavyweight and heavyweight, 2 different divisions. He wasn't holding the belts at the same time, but he was the first person to have successful defenses at 2 weight classes. Now, he was 6-3-1 in championship fights. He lost by Jon by TKO, but was later overturned when Jon tested positive for Turinabol, which was some sort of performance enhancer. But even with the 3 losses and the 1 no contest, nobody that did not know DC already expected him to do what he did throughout his UFC career. The man's about 5'10" tall, and he's about anywhere from 205 to 260 pounds. A little butterball. Like I said before, doing it for the round bodies. But nobody expected him to do the things that he did. And I think that level of expectation and what he accomplished is why he needs to be on this list where he is. The first person to defend at 2 different weight classes, being 5'10", that has to be worth something. And like I said earlier, coming from a round body himself, it means a lot. And that's why I put him at number 8 on this list. Number 7, Stipe Miocic. Over the course of Stipe's 18 UFC fights, he has 14 wins. 6 of them over former UFC champions. Andre Arlovski, Fabricio Verdum, Junior Dos Santos, Daniel Cormier. He also holds wins over former title challenger Alistair Overeem and current title holder Francis Ngannou. Now, while it is a difficult time to sell Stipe's career as one of the more sexier ones, you cannot overlook the things that he has accomplished and the people that he has beat. He is also the record holder for most title defenses in the heavyweight division at 3. The UFC heavyweight division has been around for 25 years. More than 25 years. And over that time, he has made the most title defenses. That cannot go overlooked, no matter how pretty the wins may or may not look at times. And being 6-2 in championship fights, that is absolutely amazing when it comes to the heavyweight division. Stipe hasn't had the most spectacular career in terms of highlights, but he does have quality wins. And besides what he does in the octagon, the man is also a full-time firefighter. I think this keeps Stipe grounded. I think this keeps Stipe's goals in line, and that is what has allowed him to win 6 UFC title fights. You cannot overlook the man who has the most consecutive defenses in what is the most popular division in the UFC. Now, I'm not saying it is the best division in the UFC. It is the most popular division in the UFC. Everybody wants to see a heavyweight fight, even if they don't know who that heavyweight is. So that's why people that have a little more knowledge, like myself, not too much knowledge, but a little bit of knowledge, has to remind people of the greatness that is Stipe. And that is why it was an absolute certainty that he was going to be on this list. Number 6, Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, I'm assuming this is going to be a very controversial pick for this list, me placing Khabib at number 6. But before I get into that, let's just run down his achievements. He has key wins over Rafael Dos Anjos, Edson Barboza, Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, and Justin Gaethje. And he is 13-0 in the UFC. He is tied for most title defenses, most consecutive title defenses, and most title wins. He is the only fighter on this list with an undefeated record at 29-0. Now, with all of that said, it is hard for me to place him higher on this list. It's hard for me to place him higher on this list because a lot of the 29 wins that he has are against people who are not of UFC quality. In the UFC, he has 13 wins. He has beaten Conor McGregor, who was a champion. He has beaten Dustin Poirier, who was an interim champion, and he's beaten Justin Gaethje, who was an interim champion. He also beat Rafael Dos Anjos, who was a champion. So he has 4 wins over champions, 2 of which were champs, and the other ones were interim champions. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So that means he has 9 other wins, not saying over lesser quality opponents, but the longevity in which he competed against the very top of the division is very small. But at the same time, you cannot deny the dominance in which Khabib performed with each and every time. But like I said, there are many things that go into this list. There's longevity, who you fought, when you fought them, how long you did it for, when you did it. And I feel comfortable putting Khabib at 6. I know there could be an argument for him to be a lot higher on this list. But for my list, we're going to put Khabib at a solid, very solid, amongst greats, amongst the greatest of all time. We're going to put Khabib at number 6. Number 5, Randy Couture. Now, Randy is one of my all-time favorite UFC fighters. I love the way that he fought. I love the way that he carried himself. And he did it while only starting MMA in his mid-30s. Now, over the course of his career, Randy was 16-8. And I know that doesn't sound like the most spectacular record in the world, but most of his fights were for a UFC championship. He has key wins over Vitor Belfort twice, Pedro Hizzo twice, Maurice Smith, Kevin Randleman, Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, Tim Sylvia, Mark Coleman, and professional boxer James Toney. Those are some huge names in the combat sport industry. He was also the UFC 13 heavyweight tournament winner. He was the first UFC fighter to win a championship in 2 different divisions. That's pretty simple when we're talking about champion in 2 divisions. Not as convoluted as the explanations I was trying to give earlier. Plain and simple. First one to win a light heavyweight championship. First one to win a heavyweight championship at different times in his career. First person to win a championship in 2 different weight classes. He was also the oldest champion in UFC history, winning his first one at 34 years old and winning his last one at 43. That is insane, guys. Like I said earlier, he was 16-8 in the UFC. The man was 11-6 in championship fights. We like to give LeBron James a lot of credit for being in a lot of NBA finals. 17 of this man's fights were for championships. That is insane. And I get that there wasn't as deep of a talent pool back in the early to mid 2000s, but at all times he was fighting the best. If he wasn't fighting for a championship, he was fighting a number one contenders match. This man, again, set the standard, and he did it in his 40s. We talk about godfathers of MMA, godfathers of the UFC. Randy Couture is absolutely, positively on the top of the charts when it comes to being a godfather. The man was competing with the best in the world until the age of 47. I really had no choice but to put Randy Couture in the top 5 of all time. Number 4, Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. Over the course of Demetrius's 18-fight UFC career, he holds key wins over Joseph Benavidez twice, John Dodson twice, Ray Borg, and Henry Cejudo. Now, while some of these may not be huge names, what Demetrius was able to accomplish during these 18 fights cannot go unnoticed. He was the UFC flyweight tournament winner. He has the most consecutive title wins in UFC history at 11, and he's tied with Jon Jones for most title defenses in UFC at 11. He's 12-2 in championship fights, only losing to Dominic Cruz, who was a weight class above. That was for the bantamweight title, and then losing his last fight, which was a split decision, to Henry Cejudo, which many felt that he still won. So with all that being said, the man was 12-2 in UFC fights. That means, on average, he was fighting the best person he could. It doesn't matter what we thought about the division at the time. If we thought the division was weak, he continuously did it over and over and over. 12 or 11 consecutive times. Sorry, I got mixed up with 12 because I think he won the Henry Cejudo fight, but I digress. Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson is hands down a top 5 UFC fighter of all time. Go back, watch his highlight film, watch how he performed, and you tell me, no matter what his size may have been, that he is not pound for pound one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time, and he's not deserving of being number 4 on this list. 3, Anderson Silva. Now, Anderson Silva is number 3 on this list because, in my opinion, he stayed past the point in which he should have, to put it nicely. Over his career, he was 17-7 with 1 no contest. He had key wins over Rich Franklin twice, Dan Henderson, Forrest Griffin, Damian Maia, Chael Sonnen twice, and Vitor Belfort. One of the craziest knockouts you'll see in UFC history. On top of that, he has the most Knockout of the Night award performances at 7. He has the longest title reign in UFC history at 2,457 days. That is insane. He has the longest win streak in UFC history at 16. He has the most UFC middleweight title fight wins at 11. That magical number 11. Most successful title defenses in UFC middleweight history division at 10. Most consecutive defenses in the UFC middleweight division at 10. Most finishes in the middleweight division history at 11. Most finishes in UFC title fights. UFC title fights, 9. Most total fight bonuses in UFC middleweight division history at 12. Guys, it took me 90 seconds to read off some of his accomplishments. If you go on his Wikipedia page, they are endless. But then he went on to lose a bunch of fights at the later end of his career. He started off 16-0 and he ended 17-7. Now, I think that hurts his placing on this list. I think very much the top three, you can't go wrong with picking one of them as the greatest of all time. But I think the 7 losses, the 1-7 record at the end of his career is what put him at number 3 and kind of separated the top 2. But again, you can't go wrong if you do think Anderson the Spider Silva is the greatest UFC fighter of all time. I read you some of the credentials. It's hard to argue with any of those. But he does have those 7 losses, which does hurt his shot, hurts his placement on this list. But there is no shame with having as dominant of a career as he has had, making the sport more exciting than it's ever been, and setting the standard for what a striker in the UFC can look like. I'm not going to say will look like, should look like, but can look like. He has to be recognized for what he has done, and that's why he's number 3 on this list. Number 2, George Rush St Pierre. George is by far one of the greatest UFC fighters to ever do it. He is one of the greatest pay-per-view sellers. He is one of the greatest competitors in UFC history. And during his time, he had a 20-2 record. Both of those losses he avenged. One being to Matt Hughes, who was also on this list, and another one being to Matt Serra, who has been mentioned on this list. He avenged both of those losses. He has key wins over Sean Shirk, 2 over BJ Penn, 2 over Matt Hughes, 2 over Josh Koscheck, 1 over Matt Serra, Carlos Condit, Nick Diaz, Johnny Hendricks, and beat Michael Bisping for the middleweight championship. He was the 4th multi-divisional champion in UFC history. Most UFC welterweight title fights at 14. He is tied for the most wins in UFC welterweight history at 19 with Neil Magny. He has the most wins in UFC welterweight title history at 12, second most wins in UFC history, second most title wins in UFC history, at 13, most title defenses at welterweight at 9, and he is 13-2 in championship fights. 13-2. Like I said, those losses were to Matt Hughes and Matt Serra. Both he avenged. Now, I have George at number 2 only because I think the person that in front of him was more devastating. He was a little meaner about what he did than George was. George was the ultimate competitor. He was the ultimate professional. He was the prototype that the UFC wanted all their fighters to be like. He lived up to the hype. He was the welterweight champion, retired for years, and came back and went up a division and won that championship. And still at 40 years old, I feel like he could come back today and still be a real threat at 155, 170, or 185, whatever he decided to do and his body would allow him. I still think he would be a threat. And at 40 years and damn near 6 years removed from his last fight and fighting once over the past 10, and still everybody believes he could come back and still do it, that has to put you at number 2 of the all-time UFC fighters. One fight in 10 years, and everybody still thinks you could come back and do it. Number 2, GSP. Finally, guys, number 1, Jon Bones Jones. Now, Jon has had a very, how should I say, controversial career. He has been busted for multiple different drugs throughout his career, at one point being some sort of performance enhancer, which is what wiped his second win against Daniel Cormier away. He has been involved with hit and runs. He has been involved with beating up his wife, allegedly. He has been involved with a lot. A ton. You can make a whole video on what Jon has been involved in since making his debut in the UFC back in the mid-2000s. So Jon's been around for a while, and over the course of his career, he has compiled a 21-1 record. That one loss is due to some illegal elbows that should have never been thrown due to the fight already being over, but the referee just not calling it, and then Jon pretty much being like, what do I do here besides pretty much kill this guy? So Jon threw some illegal elbows, got caught with a DQ. But over the course of that time, guys, in that one kind of fluky DQ loss and the drugs and the one no contest, Jon has beaten the best of the best. At one point, the light heavyweight division was the division of the UFC. Jon was so great, he made the light heavyweight division completely boring. Nobody wanted to see it anymore because they knew what Jon was going to do. Now, Jon beat Ryan Bader. He beat Shogun Rua. He beat Rampage Jackson, Lyoto Machida, Rashard Evans, Vitor Belfort, Chael Sonnen, Alexander Gustafsson twice, Glover Teixeira, and Daniel Cormier. Most of these guys that I named are champions. Ryan Bader was a champion in Bellator, and Alexander never became a champion, but all the rest of them were champions. He has the most wins against former champions. And he also has 11 successful title defenses. 8 the first time around, 3 the second time around. He has the longest light heavyweight championship reign at 1,501 day. That showed you how crazy Anderson Silva's was, though. He has the longest unbeaten streak at 18, and that unbeaten streak, that's where the no contest kind of messed things up. That's why it's unbeaten instead of undefeated. He has the most consecutive wins in UFC light heavyweight history at 13. Most consecutive title defenses in UFC light heavyweight history at 8. He's tied for the most successful title defenses overall in UFC history at 11 with Demetrius Johnson, previously mentioned. He has the most UFC light heavyweight title fights, the most wins in UFC light heavyweight title fight history at 14. He has the most wins in division history at 20. He is also the youngest fighter to win a UFC championship at 23 years, 242 days. And still, while being a current fighter, he has a fight in the UFC Hall of Fame against Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 165, which was one of the greatest fights of all time. Guys, I'm winded, and again, this is one of those cases where this isn't even all the accomplishments. These are just the ones that I was gonna share with you guys because it gets my point across that this is the baddest man to ever fight in the UFC. The intention in which he hit people. He wasn't out there to play a sport. He was out there to hurt you. He is the ultimate hitman. He could choreograph fight scenes in movies. He could do the John Wick. That's his fighting style. And while many people hate when fighters wrestle, when Jon wrestles, he's wrestling you to get you in a position to do damage to you. And that is rare. If Jon gets you down and he gets in his right positions, the fight is over. The elbows, the leg kicks, the knee kicks, the foot stomps. There is just a different mindset to Jon than there is most fighters. And even if Jon was to lose, he's been doing this since he was 21 years old. 20 wins in the UFC against the creme de la creme. I don't think it moves his position much. GSP got to lose. Anderson Silva got to lose. I think if it happened, Jon gets to lose too. But until I see something different, whether the fight is close or won by a mile, Jon knows what he's doing. And 98% of the time, he's in control of where that fight's going. I think he could beat everybody from 185 pounds, where they thought that one day he might drop down to, all the way up to heavyweight. He is capable of beating them. And I think that is what makes you the pound-for-pound greatest of all time. How many people did you beat? How many people could you have beat? What are your accomplishments? And Jon has done it all. Youngest champ to most title fight wins. He has done it all. He's done it against the best. He's done it to them in their prime, out of their prime, at the beginning of their career. However you want it, Jon has done it, and that is why he's number one on this list. And guys, that's the list. You know, I want to thank you for joining me. I want to thank you for putting up with my learning pains. This is the first time that I've done a list like this. It's a lot different, you know, reading from some sort of a script than just giving it to you fresh off the top. So I'm going to get better at it. I'm going through the school of hard knocks. I'm teaching myself every day, and I'm just trying to get better so I can bring you guys some worthwhile information. And I just want to thank you for putting up with me. I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to thank you for being a big kid and listening to me whenever you get the chance, guys. And like always, I want you to be safe, be easy, and wash your ass. I'm out of here. Peace.